Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 46. Before we get going on questions, I just want to say happy anniversary to my parents who celebrated year 35 this Monday. You guys have really set the bar high.
Well, as I look off screen here, I love you.
We're going to move right along to our first question here. And this is the moment that you have all been patiently awaiting for 2 weeks. So, Professor, just how big was Winston Churchill's ass?
Yes, very strange how spontaneously a number of people were asking about that. So, just how big was Winston Churchill's ass? Um, the answer is I don't know, which could end that question right here, but let me tell you why I don't know. Okay, so you got rich countries and poor countries, and every now and then poor countries become rich, or at least they become less poor. And people have studied all sorts of things about the economic transition from low income to middle income, and there's some interesting biological stuff that goes along with that. And for that, we need a recap to a few weeks ago talking about sociobiology. You will recall at the extremes, two different types of social species: pair bonding species, monogamous for life; tournament species, highly sexually dimorphic males, much bigger body mass, big old canines. And I think I mentioned in passing, one of the other features that you see, which you don't find in pair bonding species and is dramatic in tournament species, is a difference in lifespan. And what you see is by the time you get to tournament species, females live a lot longer than males do, because males have idiotic testosterone in their bloodstream, which causes cardiovascular disease, and they get into fights and they spend all of this energy on stupid muscles and secondary sexual characteristics and stuff. So in tournament species, there's usually a fairly pronounced difference in life expectancy, females living a lot longer. Baboons, my baboons, for example, who are textbook tournament species, on the average, females live almost 40% longer than males do. So you remember the punchline about humans is we're not a classical tournament species. We're not a classical pair bonding. We're somewhere in between, very confused by the standards of body mass and lung capacity and all sorts of other measures. And the same thing when you look at life expectancy. You look at the wealthiest, healthiest countries on earth, round up the Scandinavians on Q, and you look at them, and there's typically about a 7-year difference in life expectancy. Women living about 7 years longer, which works out to be about 9% or so. So we see here right in the middle, because meanwhile in those pair bonding species, there's essentially no difference in lifespan. Once again, we're caught halfway in between or so. So the normal human pattern when you get rid of disease, poverty, etc., is females have about a 7-year longer life expectancy. You look in the United States, and it's about a 6-year difference, and we are about number 30 or 40 on the list in terms of not only life expectancy, but the discrepancy by sex. And so that's interesting. Okay, so females live longer than males. And the key point about this economic transition is that often didn't used to be the case. For example, you look in the United States in 1900, and there was only a 2-year life expectancy difference between females and males. Over the century, expanding up to the 6-year one, you look in much of the developing world, and you don't find a big difference in female or male life expectancy. In a few places, it's essentially zero. And just as a helpful hint, those are not countries you want to be living in, regardless of your sex. What's that about? Amid females tend to live longer than males, and male-related physiology sets you up for all sorts of diseases and lots that developing world, women essentially are worked to death at earlier ages. And that's why you don't see that discrepancy. And the same in the United States. The transition to where the lifespan difference started getting dramatic didn't come till around the 1940s or 50s. What was that about? Great example. If ever for some reason you want to read the thousands of pages in Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, which actually is like great to read. But what he described was early in Johnson's career as a politician, one of his first boondoggly things that he did for the folks back home in the hill country in Texas in the 1930s was he got electricity. And there's a whole literature by now that when you bring electricity to developing areas, people start living longer. You can run a medical dispensary with energy and useful stuff, but the biggest thing that you see the most dramatic changes come in female lifespan because women are not getting work to get hauling water from down at the creek or whatever because there's now pumped water and chopping wood and doing huge amounts of physical labor. It's not until you see some sort of westernized economic transition that you begin to see a dramatic extension of lifespan of women relative to men. Okay. One proviso with that is that you look at a handful of countries on earth and there's a huge difference in life expectancy. Russia, ex-Eastern Bloc countries, Moldova, 11, 12-year difference of women living longer. Whoa, are we looking at the best of economic development? No, these are special cases. You have this huge gap because with the collapse of the Soviet Union around 1990, life expectancy decreased in the Soviet Union and the ex-Eastern Bloc countries, and it decreased really disproportionately in men because men were drinking themselves to death, committing suicide, dying of cardiac disease, violence, and you saw somewhat of a drop of life expectancy in women and a dramatic one in men. It is not a good thing when life expectancy is shortening in a society, and the Russian version, the Moldovan version, exaggerated this difference there. And it should be noted that the United States has been having its life expectancy decreasing in recent years, mostly because of socioeconomic inequality. Okay, what does that tell us about Winston Churchill's ass? Nothing whatsoever. Which brings us to our second transition. We just saw our first biological marker of when you were getting a westernized economy. Suddenly, women are living a lot longer than men. Here's the second marker, which is in a society who's overweight. And you look at poor countries, developing world, back when the United States was a developing country. You look back when, and it's very clear, you find obesity in the wealthy. That's a marker of the wealthy. And that is all over the world. And you look in the United States, robber baron era, where Thomas Nast was making these cartoons of like Boss Tweed, who was wider than he was tall, or William Howard Taft getting stuck in his bathtub, which apparently was an apocryphal story. But in any case, in developing economies, you find obesity in the wealthy. And it's clear what that's about, which is if you're poor in a developing country, your challenge is to get enough food. And back to economist Thorstein Veblen and his conspicuous consumption, what's the best way of advertising your wealth? By literally conspicuously consuming. What are you telling the lower? Look, I can afford lots of food and you can't. And then we look at westernized economies, and it's just the opposite. And what you see is obesity epidemic, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. I correct myself, going back to last week's episode, type 2 diabetes, obesity, all is suddenly far, far more prevalent among poorer people than the wealthy. There's a transition. And it's clear what that transition is about, which is going from the old days where the wealthy could afford food and the poor maybe not, to the current state where the wealthy can afford healthy food and the poor are running on junk food, you know, no fresh produce, all of that. So we've gone from a wealthy king of the universe being wildly voluminously overweight back then, of saying, look, I can afford food and you can't, to these days where any self-respecting like CEO shark, right after they've finished the Iron Man or something, is saying, look, I can afford a personal trainer and you can't. So we've got this interesting transition. So I got it into my head to try to be able to document when that transition occurred in westernized countries, when suddenly the wealthy became svelte and lean and mean and shark-toothed, and when that transition occurred. And I got this idea, which is Savile Row in London, which is all those shops that have been in London for some of the oldest ones, more than 200 years, cranking out the most expensive suits in England for the wealthiest men out there. They've been clothing the wealthy, the wealthiest, for 200 years. And I suddenly got in my head, this was the way to document it. So I looked up which was the oldest one of those, and I got a phone number and I called them up. And there was this guy there who had an English accent that was so impressive, it made me feel like some sort of backwoods squirrel eating American Yahoo or something in comparison, like using a bayonet to pick between my teeth and stuff, as to how genteel this guy. And I explained what this was, and I wanted it. Did he by any chance know if they had like 200 years worth of records down in the subcellar of the sizes of the most expensive suits they were selling, to begin to see when suddenly the uber wealthy ruling class in the westernized economy started slimming down. And I was so excited because he said, yes, we have the data. And I said, could I come there? Could I like go to your basement and spend weeks looking at it? And it was great. And we're actually making plans to do that. And I called him up, a follow-up. This was back in the telephone days. I called him up and he said, I'm sorry, I actually have some disappointing news. You're not going to be able to do that. And I said, what? And he said, well, we had some discussions here and we think it would not be a good idea. And then I proved that I was a complete barbarian. I said, does this have something to do with Winston Churchill's ass? Because I suspect you've got the data somewhere down in the basement to show that. And he said, just our legal department is suggesting this might not be something we would want to be sharing. And that was it. That was the end of that project, my shaggy ass story. So I never got to find out how big it was. But nonetheless, this is our second big biological marker. When women are suddenly living a lot longer than men, and when suddenly wealth gets you healthy food and memberships in exercise, health clubs and stuff, instead of just getting you more calories, that's where you see these two important biological transitions that tell you about the economic shifts in a country.
If there are any viewers in the England area, not that we're condoning breaking in, but if anyone can get those data for us, we're eager to find out. All right, next, Phil from Kenya says, could you discuss the relationship between alcohol and cancer, especially in light of the U.S. Surgeon General calling for warnings on alcoholic drinks?
Well, that is a very pertinent question. And yes, indeed, the Surgeon General in the U.S. Is pointing out the fact that alcohol is a carcinogen and it's a significant one. And the news has been filled both with the fact that alcohol is a carcinogen and the fact that the Surgeon General doesn't have a chance in hell of getting labels put on alcohol bottles. And that's even if the current administration was not going anywhere for the next half century. That's not happening anytime soon. But the science, back to the science, you will recall not that many episodes ago, I was coming down like your judgmental grandmother saying how bad alcohol is. Any level of alcohol consumption is for your health, and all the myths about moderate intake is beneficial for health have mostly turned out to be just sort of experimental confounds in the epidemiological studies. But now we've got this new area to have to deal with, which is the fact that alcohol is also a carcinogen. Okay, what is that about? First off, what sort of numbers are we looking at? And you look at the literature and wildly varying in terms of estimates of alcohol played a role in X number of deaths in the US last year, played a role, and that's a very squishy subjective thing, and it varies from one study to the next, but I've seen numbers ranging from tens of thousands to a couple of 100,000 cancer deaths each year attributable. That would not have happened if the person had not been drinking alcohol. And not only does one want to know the size of the effect, but the bargaining begins at this point. How much drinking? And what the studies tend to show is you consume one standard drink a day, which I think is like 12 to 14 grams of alcohol or something. You do that, and across the various types of cancers, number one, esophageal, mouth, digestive tract, rectum, liver, and breast. You look at those, and the increased risk from one standard drink a day ranges from about a 10 to 20% increased risk. You look at someone who is having 4 or 5 of those a day, and you're getting in the realm of multiples, like a 5-fold increase in the risk of esophageal cancer. All right, so what's that about? There's no shortage of ways in which alcohol can get you into trouble in the cancer realm. Alcohol generates oxygen radicals, not good things. It generates inflammation, not a good thing. But in addition, it turns out when alcohol, ethanol, is being broken down predominantly in your liver, among other things, the main end product is a carcinogen, acetaldehyde. Okay, what is up with that? Acetaldehyde does something, namely, it messes with your DNA. Okay, that's all you need to know. More technically, it forms jargon DNA adducts. It gloms onto one strand and disrupts its function, or glues that strand to the other side, disrupting function as well. And where does cancer come out from that? And this brings us to what is sort of the genetics of cancer. So you are a young organism, and all you're about is growing and developing, and your cells dividing and great stuff like that. And we've got all sorts of genes related to growth, prompting growth. And what happens somewhere in adolescence when you've had it with this growing, critically, crucially, all of these growth related genes are silenced forever after. And there's all sorts of mechanisms, epigenetic mechanisms for silencing growth-related genes, and they are silent forever after, and you may be able to see where we're heading with this if something comes along, radiation, a carcinogen, that damages the DNA, in this case, damages the off switch on one of these growth-related genes, damages the off switch, and suddenly at age 50, at age 70, genes are activating that hadn't been doing anything since you were in a crib, genes that are termed oncogenes. Cancer-related genes, because essentially what cancer is about is your body gets it into its head to start growing like when you were little, or at least this organ does, or at least this cluster of cells in there, and they start dividing out of control, uncontrolled growth with the potential to be metastatic, which is to say it could now spread to other organs, and this is where cancer is coming from. So it turns out that acetaldehyde, as part of the disruptive things it does to DNA, is it can damage the off switch on some of these oncogenes. Okay, you at this point should say, well, how many of these oncogenes are there? And it's like 50 or so have been identified. And we've got like 20,000 genes, like a smidgen of 1% of our genes are devoted to growth that gets silenced, where if it activates by accident, you get cancer. How is alcohol targeting these preferentially? And the answer is it isn't. Alcohol, and is having these DNA adducts, this DNA damage is just randomly hitting your genome, your strands of DNA in different places in different cells, and the vast majority of these are completely inconsequential. And every now and then, just randomly, it happens to hit the on-off switch for one of these oncogenes. And at that point, you get into trouble. So that's scary news, but fortunately, one of the things that's seen is that you begin growing tumors all the time. Oncogenes are endlessly activated because of some slip up with some on-off switch, and if two or more of them activate, you're really up the creek. But fortunately, this doesn't happen to most of us because we've got this whole universe of enzymes that repair DNA, that fix up little hiccups and little bits of glitches in DNA. And in addition, we have a whole world of genes that express proteins that are termed tumor suppressors. You got this whole surveillance system, broad spectrum, looking for mistakes in the DNA, go and fix it. And then this very specialized realm of genes that make proteins that are out looking for the starts of tumors. And these are tumor suppressors, and the system works great, except we got a second problem now, which is when that breakdown product of alcohol is messing with your DNA, some of the time what it's messing with is the DNA coding for those DNA repair enzymes or those tumor suppressors. So you're messed up on two levels. You may inadvertently begin to throw some of these off switches to the on position, and or you are damaging the quality control system up on top. And it looks like that's what's going on with it. And again, a 10-20% increase in cancer risk. That's somewhat in the eye of the beholder, but again, that's from a single standard drink a day. It's a carcinogen. So good luck to the Surgeon General getting that past the various alcohol industrial complex that's going to make sure nothing like a label ever winds up with that. But that's the mechanism for it. It inadvertently can activate growth genes that have been silent ever since you had acne, and or it could inadvertently damage the genes that are in charge of spotting when a problem like that starts and making sure it doesn't happen.
We're going to wrap up with the question, what's up with the fox domestication experiment in Russia?
What's up with it? It is wonderful. It is one of the great adventures in behavior genetics, and it's one of the great adventures in reversing like bad PR for a species. Foxes, all the way back to Aesop's fables and not Harry Potter, Beatrix Potter. Foxes have been these malevolent creatures. They're up to no good. They're mischievous. They're cunning. They're vicious. They're malevolent. A fox would gladly have eaten Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother, but the fox got outfoxed by the wolf, thus the term. Very negative connotation. And what we've got here are the world's most adorable foxes. And this was all work started many decades ago by a Russian geneticist, at the time a Soviet geneticist, named Dmitry Balyaev, and who spent the last 26 years of his life doing this experiment. Early on, he got an assistant, at the time an 18-year-old volunteer named Ludmila Trut. And before it was over with, she had a doctorate in animal sciences and eventually inherited the project and kept it going for decades and decades, the Siberian Silver Fox Project. So the notion was, can we start selectively breeding, artificial selection? Can we start selectively selecting for? Could you start artificial selection to make foxes, wild foxes, tamer? And they had sort of this colony of foxes there. And the criteria were very straightforward. You're looking for the subset of foxes who were less afraid of humans, who were easier to approach. You go in there with some food and you see, is the fox willing to take it from you? Is the fox willing, while that's happening, for you to touch its head? Does it respond by running away, by biting you? Does it respond by eating the food you're offering? You could begin to identify the small subset of foxes who were somewhat less fearful of humans than the rest. And then you put those ones together and let them breed and let their most tame offspring breed and on over a bunch of generations. And what you begin to do is, in effect, domesticating these Siberian foxes into being tamer, into being around humans. And soon, within a few generations, they were seeing wild stuff. By the fourth generation of this selective breeding for this one behavioral trait, lack of fear of humans, by then the mere lack of fear was beginning to transition into something totally different. These were now foxes that would want to be around humans. They would come up and they would whimper for your attention. They would lick you. They would wag their tails. Foxes don't wag tails. By about the fourth generation, these were doing it. By about the 20th generation, about 40% of the foxes in the colony had now been bred for these criteria: willing to lick your hand, willing to be petted. By the 30th generation, 80% of the foxes were this way, and you had just bred adorable domesticated foxes who just want to cuddle up in your arms, and you look at the pictures of them and you can't believe how adorable they are, and isn't this great? And it worked. They were able to domesticate foxes over the course of about 35 generations, domesticate them to the point that the behavior genetics in them had changed dramatically. The behavior had changed. These were now tamed foxes that were not only tolerant of humans, they wanted humans to pick them up and rub their little floppy ears and kiss them and give them Halloween costumes. And so a demonstration of the power of behavior genetics. So, in retrospect, this was a hugely challenging thing to pull off. For one thing, at the time when the experiments were starting, being a geneticist in the Soviet Union was still a little bit of a dangerous thing because of the shadow still of Lysenko, a wildly destructive quasi-scientist who took over Soviet genetics during Stalin's era and had all sorts of crackpot, unsupportable ideas about the genetics of plant breeding. And before it was over with, he had engineered massive famines. And so being a geneticist, you still had to somewhat carefully toe the party line in the 1960s about that Lysenko stuff. So just starting off, this was a controversial thing. And eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the economy was a disaster, by then, the two of them, Belyayev and Trut, were having to heroically try to keep the funding going to feed the foxes. And clearly what they never hit on was the idea of making giant fox petting zoos for having tourists come in, or even better, selectively breed their foxes to look like little bouncy pygmy hippos. But they managed to make it through that period. So this was like a heroic undertaking, landmark demonstration of selective breeding for a behavioral trait. But from about that fourth generation, something else was happening, which they noticed that as they were breeding for this behavioral trait, breeding solely based on this behavioral trait of degree of aversion to humans and eventually degree of attraction to humans, all they should have been doing was changing the genetics of the behavior. But the appearance of the foxes were changing also. And their tails not only suddenly were wagging the fox, but they were getting curly, not like you normally see. And their fox ears were getting floppy, and their snouts were getting foreshortened, and their foreheads were getting rounder, and their eyes were getting bigger, and they were getting cute. They were getting cute, and their coloration, silver foxes were like uniforms. They were beginning to get patches, and they looked like fox Dalmatians and fox. And what was up with that? You breed for a behavioral trait, and suddenly you get all of these physical changes. And this turns out to be a motif in domestication. What domestication is about is making an animal act like a baby, like a perpetual youngin, a youngin who's not aggressive and is oriented towards mommy, whichever human is feeding them. When you suddenly, or not so suddenly, domesticating the species, domestication is about breeding for neoteny, still retaining childlike behavioral features and baggage carried along inseparably, selecting for childlike physical features as well. And that's why dogs are much cuter than wolves, and that's why I don't know who else is domesticated, but the domestication process involves not only behavioral neotenizing, making you like a neonate again, but physical anatomical neotenizing as well. And one of the most common motifs that goes on in all these domesticated species is they're not as smart as their wild counterparts, their ex-cousins, and their brains aren't as big because they're being bred for acting like babies, and that's what dogs are. Dogs have been domesticated to act like baby wolves because they're cute and adorable, and when a dog is leaping up to lick your face because he loves you, what he's hoping is that you, the mama wolf, by licking there, you're going to regurgitate some food for him. That's what your dog is up to there. Their baby wolves domestication does this. So this is what was also going on as well. Anatomical changes, physiological changes, a finding that warmed my heart endlessly. These domesticated foxes had 1/4 the stress hormone levels in their bloodstream as the original generation of foxes. Their adrenaline, epinephrine, sympathetic nervous system was also turned off to the same extent. They were oriented towards humans. They could do something that dogs are great at, but a chimp, brilliant chimp, can never learn to do, and a wolf could never learn to do, and presumably a wild fox could never learn to do, which is gaze following. Their human is looking somewhere interesting, and they look there too. They've learned that humans have information that could be really, so they do gaze following. You could train your Siberian fox to sit and play fetch with the ball. They're totally great. So what's the lesson of this? When you were breeding for domestication, when you were breeding for a trait, a behavioral traits don't happen in vacuo. They come with all sorts of physical stuff along with it. Totally amazing scientific legacy that this showed. Trutt, incidentally, Ludmilla Trutt died a few months ago at age 90, and she was still publishing papers on her Siberian foxes up to last year. One of the unexpected findings in the field is amid that general sort of result of brains get smaller with domestication. That appears not to be the case with the domesticated Siberian foxes. Their brains haven't gotten smaller. I don't know, come back in 100 generations of them. So that's the Siberian fox story. Just to throw in some killjoy, researcher named Eleanor Carlson, where is she? University of Massachusetts, has analyzed the Siberian fox data and is making the argument that these foxes actually weren't all that wild to begin with, the original colony umpteen generations ago. So you probably were already having some degree of selection for tamer ones. What does that do to our wonderful story? It means probably it occurred faster than would have occurred if it truly had been a completely wild population. Wonderful book about this called How to Tame a Fox, by Ludmilla Trutt, along with Lee Dugatkin, who's an American ethologist who's written a couple of books. That's a great fun book to read. So that is how foxes came to be as adorable as Mudeng.
And just as a recent tidbit, a number of papers came out a few years ago showing how some urban red foxes in the UK are showing sort of early signs of the usual patterns of self-domestication. The shorter snouts and smaller brains than rural foxes, less sexual dimorphism. So cool new examples. And that concludes episode 46. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.